I will never forget the time I was in Israel with my husband, well, that was the second time, but the first time with my mother on a pilgrimage. And I was standing in the ticket line, and I remember looking behind me, and in the snake of the ticket line was a guy who looked very familiar. I had no idea who he was. And I told my mom, this guy looks so familiar. And as a typical mother, she said, go and say hi. No. We were late for our flight, and I'm not going to come off like a crazy person that's just weird. That ended up being Charlie. Nothing is by coincidence.
People used to laugh off the whole honeypot talk like it was just wild internet drama, something too crazy to take seriously. But then things shifted fast when Charlie Kirk's sister, Mary Kirk, started pointing out details about Erika's past that didn't line up clean. Suddenly, clips started popping up, moments people hadn't paid attention to before. And that perfect background didn't look so simple anymore. What once seemed random started feeling way more calculated the longer people looked at it. And now that the grieving widow narrative is falling apart, the conversation has flipped completely. It's not about if she was placed anymore, it's about who could be behind it. Let's keep it real. For a long time, everything about Erika Kirk was stuck in the shadows of comment sections and random forums. People brushed it off as noise, just online chatter with no weight behind it. But the energy changed the moment it didn't come from strangers anymore. Once Charlie Kirk's own circle started pulling back quietly, people stopped focusing on what trolls were saying and started questioning what insiders might know. That shift hit different. It didn't get louder. It got sharper, more focused, harder to ignore. That's when the word honeypot stopped sounding like drama and started sounding like strategy. Because when you line up Erika's timeline step by step, it doesn't feel random anymore. It feels structured, like pieces falling into place too neatly.
Was until I hosted the first Trump rally in Trump rally history right here in Arizona in 2015. I got a call from Miss Erika Kirk, Miss Arizona 2012. I just want to help, she said. So naturally, I put her right behind the president.
Her image had been built as clean, disciplined, faith-driven, untouched by any controversy. Someone who claimed she stayed away from wild scenes, relationships, or anything messy. The picture looked flawless until people started digging deeper. And once they did, everything cracked wide open. Old clips started resurfacing out of nowhere. Reality TV appearances, past moments, things that didn't match the image at all. The contrast hit hard, and people started asking how all of this stayed hidden for so long. Suddenly, what looked polished and controlled started feeling like something completely different. Then even more details started coming out, and this is where things really got messy. Old relationships, public boyfriends, magazine interviews where she openly praised past partners like Tyler Massey. All of it resurfaced fast. And the problem wasn't just that it existed. It was that it completely clashed with the image she had been presenting. The version of herself she showed the public didn't match the receipts people were now seeing. That alone shook her credibility hard. But the bigger question wasn't just about the inconsistencies. It was about why they existed in the first place. People started asking, why would someone go so far to rewrite their own past, unless there was something deeper they didn't want seen? That's when the whole situation shifted direction. This wasn't just about image anymore. It became about access and positioning. Because long before Charlie Kirk was even in the picture, Erika Kirk was already moving in powerful circles. She wasn't some random outsider stepping into influence. She was already there, already connected, already in the rooms that matter. And that's the part that made people pause. She won Miss Arizona on her very first try. Something people in the pageant world say is extremely rare.
We have 5 major threats that make our grid extremely vulnerable that we've presented to congressional officials. 1 being cyber, 2 being hackers, 3 being physical threats, 4th one is solar EMP, and the 5th one is man-made EMP. So the concern that we have is that we put out this critical information, and when we go over this risk analysis, they hear what we're saying, but they don't want to take action.
Then she stepped into a major role as a talent director for Miss USA while Donald Trump still owned the organization. At the same time, she was reportedly involved in running a nonprofit overseas, said to be based in Romania, alongside her mother, Lori Franz Fay, who had a military background. So now you've got politics, pageants, and international activity all happening at once, and people started asking how all of that connects. But then something even more unexpected surfaced. An old documentary from years ago quietly reappeared online. And inside it, Erika wasn't just in the background. She was front and center, presenting to national security professionals about cyber warfare and power grid risks. Not observing, not assisting, actually presenting alongside former intelligence and security officials. That clip made people stop scrolling immediately. Because that kind of role isn't casual, and it's not something just anyone steps into. What really caught attention was her age at the time. She was only 27, with no widely known background in intelligence, defense, or cybersecurity, yet there she was, positioned like an expert among specialists. That's when people stopped brushing everything off as rumors. It wasn't about gossip anymore. It was about gaps that didn't make sense. Online reactions started getting more intense as people tried to connect the dots. Some saw patterns, others raised questions about timing, roles, and how everything lined up. Once those contradictions stacked up, the curiosity only grew stronger.
How did your mom choose Phoenix?
So she chose to move to Phoenix from Ohio because there was more of an opportunity for a female business owner out here, especially from the standpoint of she was getting involved with the government, so Homeland Security and Department of Defense. And so she had other business partners that were out here that were already in that industry, even one that was a mentor of hers. So it was really convenient to be able to come all together in one place to really.
And when people started looking deeper into her background and connections, it opened up even more layers that hadn't been fully explored before. Erika had always presented her story in a very specific way. She said she was raised by a single mother, distant from her father, and mostly disconnected from any kind of power structure. But later, interviews started telling a different story. And that's where people began to pause. Because her mother didn't just relocate to Arizona for a fresh start after a divorce like it was originally framed, reports and past details suggested that move was tied to government-related work involving Homeland Security, defense departments, and contractors operating in those spaces. That changes the context completely. Then another layer came into focus. Her mother wasn't just working regular jobs. She reportedly founded a tech company connected to military and intelligence contracts. And the father, who was described as absent, he was quietly listed as a program research director within that same network. So now, instead of a disconnected background, people started seeing a family deeply linked to defense-related industries. That's a huge shift in how everything is viewed. When those details lined up, Erika's presence in military environments didn't look random anymore. It started to look like something she had access to through family connections, and that's exactly when the spotlight swung back to Romanian Angels, the charity she was associated with. On the surface, it was presented as humanitarian work, helping children through donations, visits, and support programs in Romania.
Obviously, we know that Erika Kirk began the Romanian Angels Project in late 2012, early 2013, through to 2015. And obviously, you have seen all the TikToks describing the scandal. Lori Francevy established the Everyday Heroes Foundation, which was supposed to help children in need. That was established in Arizona under Erika's mother's name, Lori Francevy. What they decided to do, as charities do, is that they develop certain projects and certain missions, and what spun out from Lori's charity was the Romanian Angels Project. And they got this deal with the military. They worked with the military in Romania to help orphans, okay? Now, it is a fact that they worked with, at that time, Colonel Otto Buscher. Colonel Otto Buscher was then accused of running a brothel with young children, taking them onto the military base for himself, his sexual needs. A woman filed in Romania and said, this is what's actually happening. These children are going onto the base and they're being prostituted to military men. So it was not, there is no articles that say Erika Francevy or Lori were involved in this, but it is a fact that they were working on the Romanian project with Colonel Buscher. They thanked him. And then Colonel Buscher gets accused of running a Romanian brothel with Romanian children.
It sounded positive and straightforward at first glance. But once people started digging deeper, questions began stacking up quickly. Erika wasn't Romanian. Her family didn't have clear roots there, and there wasn't an obvious connection explaining why she would be operating in that region specifically. On top of that, reports suggested activity around military-linked environments and NATO-related areas, but with very little public documentation explaining how those operations were structured. That lack of clarity made people uncomfortable.
Sinister, okay? There were some very weird things going on. Did you know that Erika Kirk was Miss Arizona and worked for this guy's pageants back in 2012? The same guy who bragged on a TV show that because he owned the pageants, he would go in and watch them change. Okay, that's strange. Odd strike number one. Number two, did you know that she ran a charity organization in the country Romania, and there are locals in Romania that said that there was some very, very heinous, sinister things going on, but the authorities wouldn't do anything about it.
Especially given the region's complicated history with international adoption controversies and oversight concerns. That's when the bigger question hit. How exactly did she gain that level of access? Once people connected her family's defense ties with her ability to move within those environments, the charity started looking different in the eyes of critics. It didn't immediately read as just a charity anymore. Some began to question whether it also functioned as something more structured behind the scenes. Then attention shifted again to how she met Charlie Kirk, because the story didn't stay consistent. In one version, she described spotting a stranger at an airport in Israel and not even knowing who he was at the time. But when timelines were compared with public appearances and known connections, people noticed overlaps that didn't quite match that story. There were indications she had already been around his extended circle before that moment, attending events, interacting with people connected to him, even being in spaces where introductions could naturally happen. When those details are lined up side by side, the meeting stops feeling random and starts looking far more planned. That's when some observers began using stronger language to describe the situation, not as drama, but as something more deliberate. What made things even more intense was what happened after Charlie passed away. Instead of stepping back from the spotlight, Erika's public presence seemed to grow quickly. Appearances increased, responsibilities expanded.
And I was standing in the ticket line, and I remember looking behind me, and in the snake of the ticket line was a guy who looked very familiar. I had no idea who he was. And I told my mom, this guy looks so familiar. And as a typical mother, she said, go and say hi. No, we were late for our flight, and I'm not going to come off like a crazy person that's just weird. That ended up being Charlie. Nothing is by coincidence.
And she moved into roles connected to the structures he had built. That rapid shift caught attention, not necessarily because of ambition, but because of the timing. It all happened very fast, and people noticed. At the same time, there were discussions circulating that Charlie had been raising concerns about donors and outside influence before everything changed. Some claimed he was starting to question certain dynamics quietly behind the scenes. And then, not long after, he was gone. And Erika appeared aligned with many of those same systems he had reportedly been pushing back against. That connection raised even more questions for those following closely. Then the internet picked up on another detail. It wasn't just political narratives that seemed to shift, it was personal ones too. Erika had previously claimed she hadn't dated seriously before Charlie, but public records suggested multiple relationships, including one overlapping with the timeline she had described differently. Even more, some of those connections were within Charlie's broader circle. That changes everything, because it suggests she didn't just enter his life randomly. She was already around, already connected, already part of that environment before their relationship became public. For many people watching, that added another layer of complexity that was hard to ignore. At this point, public opinion split sharply. Some still dismissed everything as coincidence, while others argued that too many details lined up in ways that felt intentional. Because this wasn't just one unusual detail.
That in order for me to know that that was my man, he had to blanket Charlie as a job interview. Because if that went in, no joke, if he came to me and said, hey, let's go on a date to Bill's Burgers, I'd be like, I am so sorry. Thank you, but no, we're not doing this. That was my mindset. I was not in that headspace. I just wasn't. But God will work in incredible ways when you surrender the pen for him to write your love story. And when you know that, look, if I remain in the jet stream of God's will, he will provide for me in ways I cannot even imagine. And that is my prayer for you. My prayer for you is to remain.
It was a chain of them. Pageant success, access to elite spaces, family ties to defense sectors, overseas charity operations, media appearances, political proximity, shifting narratives, family tensions. and a sequence of events that all seem to happen at very specific moments. And once people saw that full chain laid out, the conversation stopped being simple and turned into something much bigger. When you look at each detail on its own, it's easy to brush it off. Anyone can say one moment doesn't mean much. One connection doesn't prove anything. One inconsistency can happen. But when those details start stacking up, when they begin forming a pattern instead of isolated moments, that's when people stop seeing randomness and start seeing structure. And structure is what makes this whole situation hit differently for so many watching closely. Because patterns don't just appear out of nowhere. They build over time, piece by piece, moment by moment, until suddenly everything starts lining up in a way that feels too clean to ignore. That's exactly what pushed this conversation into a completely new space. It stopped being about a few questionable details and turned into something bigger, something layered, something that people feel needs a closer look. And here's where it gets even more intense. When someone's story keeps changing over time, when different versions of the same events don't fully match up, people naturally start asking deeper questions. Not just what might be inaccurate, but what might be intentionally left out or reshaped. Because consistency builds trust. And once that consistency starts to crack, it opens the door for doubt to grow fast. That's why the term honeypot hasn't disappeared from the conversation. It keeps resurfacing, not because there's confirmed proof behind it, but because some people believe the overall pattern fits a certain kind of structure too well. And what makes patterns powerful is that they don't need to shout to be noticed. They build quietly, slowly, until enough pieces are visible for people to connect them on their own. Once that happens, everything changes. Because once people feel like they can see a pattern, it becomes incredibly hard to unsee it. Every new detail gets looked at through that same lens. Every past moment gets re-examined. Every timeline gets questioned. And that's exactly what's happening here. Now, the focus isn't just on individual claims anymore. It's on how everything connects. People are looking at timelines, relationships, access points, career moves, and public narratives all at once. They're asking how these elements interact, how they overlap, and why certain events seem to fall into place at very specific moments. That's where the idea of alignment starts coming in, because coincidences usually feel scattered. They don't follow a clear direction. They don't build on each other in a consistent way. But what some observers are pointing out here is something different. They're saying this doesn't feel scattered. It feels aligned. And that difference is exactly why the conversation hasn't slowed down. Then you have the timing of everything, which adds another layer to the discussion. Timing always matters in situations like this. When certain shifts happen quickly, when roles change fast, when visibility increases at key moments, people start paying even closer attention. Not because timing alone proves anything, but because it adds context to everything else that's already being questioned. And the truth is, once timing enters the conversation, it amplifies everything. It makes every decision look more intentional. It makes every move feel more calculated. And even if that's not the case, perception becomes reality for a lot of people watching from the outside. That's why the questions keep building instead of fading away. If everything was completely natural, why does it appear so structured to some? If every step happened organically, why do certain moments seem to connect so precisely? These are the kinds of questions people are asking, and they're not going away anytime soon. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not everyone sees it the same way. Some still believe all of this can be explained through coincidence, timing, and circumstance. They see the same details, but interpret them completely differently. And that split in perspective is exactly what keeps the conversation alive. Because when one group sees coincidence and another sees pattern, the discussion doesn't end, it grows. It becomes a back and forth, with each side pointing to different details, different interpretations, different conclusions. And that tension is what keeps people engaged, watching, and debating. Another factor that keeps this topic active is how quickly information spreads today. The moment something surfaces, it gets shared, analyzed, broken down, and discussed across multiple platforms. People don't just consume information anymore, they participate in it. They connect dots, they compare timelines, they look for links that others might have missed, and once that process starts, it doesn't slow down easily, because every new piece of information has the potential to either support or challenge what people already believe. That constant flow of updates keeps the situation dynamic, constantly evolving, constantly shifting. But here's the key point that keeps everything centered. None of this conversation exists because of one single moment. It exists because of accumulation. It's the buildup of details, the layering of events, the repetition of patterns that keeps people paying attention. That's why the focus has moved away from individual claims and toward the bigger picture. People aren't just asking about one decision, one relationship, or one moment anymore. They're asking how everything fits together as a whole. And when you look at it from that perspective, it becomes clear why the discussion hasn't faded. Because once people start looking at the bigger picture, they start seeing connections they didn't notice before. And once those connections are seen, they become part of the narrative moving forward. So now the conversation continues to circle around the same central question. If this was simply a natural relationship, why does it appear so structured to some observers? Why do certain elements seem to align in ways that feel intentional? And why do those patterns continue to hold attention even as time passes? These aren't simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. That's exactly why they keep coming up. Because as long as there are details that can be interpreted in different ways, the conversation will keep going. At the end of the day, what keeps this topic alive isn't just the details themselves, it's how people interpret them. It's the difference between seeing coincidence and seeing pattern. It's the gap between explanation and speculation. And that gap is where most of the discussion lives. So the question that keeps echoing hasn't changed. Is everything exactly as it appears? Or is there more beneath the surface that hasn't been fully understood yet? That's what people keep coming back to. And that's why the conversation isn't slowing down anytime soon. Drop your thoughts below, hit like, subscribe, share, and let's keep this discussion going. See you on the next one.